Hands that built the light. In the days when England was torn by strife, when the crown itself was a prize, fought over by claimants who called themselves chosen by God, when the land was restless with hunger and the roads were dangerous with thieves, there lived a mason named Tom. He was not rich, nor powerful, nor known beyond the towns where he worked, but in his heart he carried a vision larger than the kingdom itself. For Tom the mason dreamed of stone. He dreamed of a building so vast and so fair that it would seem to touch the sky. A house of God raised not for 1 year or 1 lifetime, but for centuries, a work of hands that would outlast the flesh that built it. Yet dreams do not warm a cold night, and dreams do not feed empty bellies. Tom walked from village to village, from one lord's manor to another, seeking work. With him went his wife Agnes, patient and weary, and his children Alfred and Martha, who had known more of hunger than of plenty. The roads were long, the seasons harsh, and coin was scarce. Winter pressed down upon them, and no lord had work for a mason in those months. And so the family drifted, hope thinning, steps heavy. On a day of snow and bitter wind, Agnes, heavy with child, gave birth on the open road. The birth was hard, the mother weak, and when it was done the child lived, but Agnes did not. Tom held the infant in his arms, and grief filled him so deeply he thought the earth itself might open and swallow him. He had no milk to give the child, no roof to shield it, no strength to carry all his burdens. In despair he thought to leave the babe in the forest, to let it die quietly in the silence of the trees. But as he stood there, torn between love and hopelessness, the trees parted, and from them stepped a woman. Her name was Ellen. She was wild in appearance, with hair unbound, eyes fierce, and words that seemed to come from some hidden knowledge. She lived in the woods with her own child, a boy named Jack, who watched the world with a curious gaze, half fearful, half full of wonder. Ellen looked upon Tom's newborn and upon Tom's sorrow, and she did not turn away. She took them in, and from that moment their lives were bound. Tom had lost one companion, but gained another, and with her he began again to walk the road, not alone, but with the strange woman and her strange child beside him. Far from these wanderers, in the small town of Kingsbridge, stood an abbey that was crumbling, poor and nearly forgotten. Its monks prayed, its fields yielded little, and its buildings showed their age. But among them was a man named Philip. He was young yet, earnest and strong in faith, though his heart often wrestled with doubt. When he prayed not only for salvation, but for guidance, for he wished to do more than keep rules and chant hours. He wished to build a place where God might be honored in greatness. And when chance placed him as prior of Kingsbridge, he looked upon the decayed church and the worn cloisters, and he saw not ruin, but possibility. In his mind rose the thought of a cathedral, larger and finer than any for miles around, a place that would draw pilgrims and secure the abbey's future. He had no mason, no gold, no patron, but he had faith, and in faith he began to dream. So it was that dream met dream. For Tom the mason came at last to Kingsbridge, seeking work once more, and Philip the prior saw in him the very hands he needed. And together they began what would become the work of lifetimes, the raising of the cathedral. But the world beyond Kingsbridge was not kind. Lords feuded, armies marched, famine came and went, and among the lords there was one named William Hamley, whose heart was as hard as the stones Tom sought to raise. William envied, William hated, William destroyed, and wherever his men rode, fields burned and women wept. Among his victims was the family of Shiring. The Earl was slain, his lands seized, his children scattered. His son Richard was left landless, and his daughter Aliena endured shame and pain beyond words. Yet Aliena did not bow her head. She swore an oath to restore her brother's fortunes, to make him earl again, though she had no land, no soldiers, no power. She had only her will, and with that will she began to trade in wool, walking markets, bargaining with merchants, turning hardship into coin. Slowly, painfully, she built a life from ashes, and in the midst of all this rose Jack, the boy of Ellen, the child of the forest. He was unlike others, quiet, thoughtful, dreaming. He learned from Tom, watching how stone was cut, how arches were shaped, how walls bore weight. He learned from books when he could find them, and from the tales his mother told of the wide world. In him burned a mind that asked questions, that sought new answers, that would not be bound by old ways. And as he grew to manhood, he and Aliena found one another, bound not by duty or bargain, but by love, though love in that age was never simple and never free. The years turned, and the cathedral grew. Stone by stone, wall by wall, arch by arch, fires came and ruined what had been built. Famine starved the workers, enemies tore down what they could not claim. But always the building rose again. For Tom had passed, but Jack carried his dream. Philip faced rivals and plots, but he held to his faith. Aliena endured loss, yet she did not break. And in time, what had been nothing but vision became a towering shape against the sky. William Hamley still raged, still sought to crush, still brought ruin. Yet he could not unmake what others raised in hope. And at last, when his strength was gone, and his cruelty brought him low, the Cathedral of Kingsbridge stood complete. Its towers reached upward, its windows shone with colours of light, its stones told of toil and suffering and triumph. It was more than a church, it was the dream of many, forged through fire and loss, made real by hands that would one day turn to dust. And so it remained when kings fell and wars ended, when those who built it were long gone. The cathedral endured, as if to say that though flesh is frail and life is brief, what is built in faith and in hope may stand forever. And the work began, though at first it was nothing but earth and timber and sweat. Tom the mason, before death claimed him, set the first stones, showing the younger men how to cut the blocks, how to square the corners, how to lift with rope and pulley. The townsfolk came to watch, for never before had Kingsbridge seen such a work. They marvelled at the ambition of their prior and the daring of the mason. And though some doubted, saying it was folly, others whispered that perhaps this would be a holy work, blessed by God. Yet no blessing fell like coin from heaven. The coffers of the priory were meagre, and each stone placed was a trial, each wage earned was a sacrifice. In those days, Jack was still a boy, though his eyes had already grown deep with thought. He followed Tom, watching, learning, dreaming of shapes beyond what his master knew. He carved little figures from wood, and he listened to stories of far lands, of cathedrals where windows were wide and walls soared high. Tom saw in him a spark, but Tom's son Alfred saw only rivalry. Alfred was broad of shoulder, blunt of mind, skilled enough with hammer and chisel, but blind to beauty. Where Jack imagined arches like wings, Alfred thought only of weight and strength. The two grew side by side, but not in friendship, and as the stones rose, so too did troubles rise. For William Hamley looked upon Kingsbridge with envy, seeing trade flow, seeing pilgrims come, seeing the beginnings of wealth that might slip from his grasp. He sent men to harry the builders, to break scaffolds, to frighten labourers. And when fire swept through the market square, consuming shops and homes, many whispered that William's hand had struck unseen. The flames licked even at the unfinished walls of the cathedral, blackening stone, undoing months of toil in one night. The people wept, yet when the ashes cooled, Philip called them back. Jack lifted new beams, and the work began again. Meanwhile, Aliena, far from stone and mortar, toiled in trade. She gathered wool from shepherds, spun bargains with merchants, carried her wares to market. Men scoffed at her, saying wool was no work for a lady, saying a woman could not build a fortune. Yet she stood firm, for she had sworn an oath. Each sack of wool she sold was a step toward restoring her brother's name, toward redeeming her father's honor. But the path was cruel, and her heart grew heavy with loneliness, though in secret she thought often of Jack, who alone looked at her not as a fallen lady, nor as a merchant, but as herself. Richard, her brother, was less steadfast. He sought glory with the sword, dreaming of banners and castles, but glory slipped through his fingers. He fought when called, he rode with lords who promised him lands, but he was too reckless, too careless. His hope rested always on Aliena's shoulders, and she bore the weight without complaint, though it bent her near to breaking. In Kingsbridge the years turned, and the cathedral grew like a tree, sometimes in green strength, sometimes struck by storm. Columns rose, but vaults cracked. Arches stretched, but scaffolds fell. Hunger stalked the workers, and some seasons there was no bread. Philip prayed, doubting yet enduring, watching his vision falter, then rise again. He faced the Bishop Valeran, a man clothed in power but empty in mercy, who sought to bind the priory under his thumb. Valeran schemed, William threatened, famine spread, yet Philip returned each day to the half-built walls, touching the stone as if to draw strength from it. And Jack, grown to manhood, left for a time to wander. He sought knowledge in France, where he saw with his own eyes the birth of a new style, the pointed arch, the ribbed vault, the walls that could open to light rather than close against it. He studied glass that shone with colours brighter than jewels, glass that told the stories of saints to those who could not read. In those shapes, in that light, he saw the future of Kingsbridge. He returned not as a boy, but as a master in his own right, and with him came the new vision, a cathedral that would not only stand but soar, a house of light rather than darkness. Yet his return did not bring peace. Alfred, now a man, resented him more than ever. Alfred coveted Aliena, and in time he won her hand by law, though not by love. Jack's heart broke, and he vanished once more, leaving Aliena in cold marriage and bitter regret. Alfred built as his father had taught him, strong but heavy, blind to beauty. His vaults collapsed, his walls groaned, and still he blamed others. Aliena bore his cruelty, but at last, with courage long hidden, she left him, choosing hardship with Jack over comfort with Alfred. Their union was not blessed by priests, not honoured by lords, yet it was truer than any. Through famine, fire and feud, the cathedral crept upward. Each stone told a story of labour, of hands cut by chisels, of backs bent beneath weight. Each window promised light yet unseen, and though William Hamley struck again, burning fields, hanging men, spreading terror, he could not halt the rising walls. For the dream was stronger than his hate, and the faith of many outweighed the cruelty of one. And when William at last faced justice, when his name sank into infamy, the cathedral still stood. Its towers reached skyward, its windows blazed with colour, its nave echoed with song. Philip, old and weary, walked its aisles and gave thanks. Jack, grey at the temples, looked upward and saw his vision complete. Aliena, weathered by years but unbroken, stood beside him, her oath fulfilled not by restoring a title, but by building something that would outlast any title. Richard, grown older, found peace in humility, and Alfred's memory faded like dust. And so the Cathedral of Kingsbridge stood, not as the work of one man, nor of one generation, but of many lives woven together. Tom who dreamed, Ellen who defied, Philip who believed, Aliena who endured, Jack who built, Richard who fought and failed and learned, William who destroyed and was destroyed. Their fates carved into stone, their struggles shining through glass, their voices echoing in prayers that rose like smoke to the rafters. And when kings fell and kingdoms shifted, when wars ended and new wars began, still the cathedral stood. Its stones whispered of suffering turned to hope, of loss turned to beauty, of human hands shaping something greater than themselves. And those who walked within its walls felt not only the weight of stone, but the weight of lives lived and dreams fulfilled. The years of hunger came, as they had before, and as they would again, for in that land no season was certain, and the harvests could be cruel. The summer rains drowned the grain, the autumn frosts came early, the stores in the barns were thin. Bread grew smaller, and then it vanished. Mothers gave their children watery broth, and then they gave them nothing. Men sold their tools for a loaf, then they sold their cloaks, then they sold the roofs over their heads, and still the hunger gnawed. In Kingsbridge, the work on the cathedral slowed. For empty bellies have no strength to lift stone, no strength to cut wood. The scaffolds stood bare, the chisels silent, and the wind blew through the open walls. Philip prayed for relief, prayed for mercy, prayed for grain to fill the town's bellies. He sent to neighbouring lords for help, but the lords hoarded what little they had, or sold it at great price. One lord in particular, William Hamley, laughed at their plight. William had no pity. He kept his grain locked behind gates while his men patrolled the roads, robbing those who carried food to market. He grew fat while others starved, And in his hall he feasted, and his laughter echoed against the rafters, while outside children cried. William thought himself strong, but he was hollow. He burned villages to hear the screams. He hung men to watch their legs twitch. He broke women to hear them beg. Yet even as he indulged his cruelty, he felt the shadow of emptiness behind him. For William had no love, no beauty, no faith. His name was feared, but not honored, and when he rode, the peasants cursed behind his back. And though he destroyed much, he could not destroy the dream that grew in Kingsbridge, for every time he struck, the people gathered again, lifting one another, rebuilding what was lost. It was in these years of hunger that Aliena proved her vow most strongly. She took the wool that few could buy, carried it across the land, and bargained with hard-faced merchants. Her hands grew rough, her body thin, but her eyes remained clear. She thought always of Richard, of her father's name, of the promise she had made beside a prison wall long ago. She turned each fleece into coin, each coin into hope. And when others bent beneath famine, she endured. Jack, too, endured. Though his heart carried its own hunger, he longed for Aliena even when she was far, even when she was bound by duty to another. He carved stone by day, and by night he traced lines in the dust, arches and vaults that had not yet risen. He dreamed of glass, coloured like jewels, glowing with the fire of the sun. He spoke little, but when he looked at the stones of Kingsbridge, he saw not what was, but what could be. Walls that breathed light, towers that reached like prayers. Philip, older now, bore the burdens of many. He faced not only famine, but the schemes of Bishop Valoran, who cloaked his ambition in the language of faith. Valoran sought to take Kingsbridge under his control, to make the cathedral his monument rather than God's. He whispered in the ears of lords, he plotted with William, he used the hunger of the people as a weapon against their prior. Yet Philip did not yield. He bent like a reed in the storm, but he did not break. He gave his own bread to the starving, he sold what little the monastery possessed, and he stood each day before the unfinished cathedral as if his presence alone would hold it together. And still the building rose, though slowly, though painfully. Stones were laid, then stones fell. A wall was raised, then a storm toppled it. A vault was begun, then hunger drove the masons away. Yet always, when the storm passed, when the hunger eased, when strength returned, the people came back. They lifted the stones again, cut the timbers again, built the scaffolds again. Their work was slow, their progress fragile, but each season the cathedral grew a little taller, a little stronger. William saw it and seethed. He sent his men to break the scaffolds, to set fires in the night. He ambushed wagons that carried timber, he blocked the quarries, he spread fear. Yet for every blow he struck, the builders struck back with patience. For William lived only in the moment of destruction, but Philip and Jack and Aliena lived in the vision of what would stand when destruction had passed. And so the famine years ended, as all years end. The rains gave way to sun, the fields yielded grain, bread returned to the tables of the poor. Strength returned to the arms of the masons, and with it, the sound of chisels rang once more across Kingsbridge. The cathedral grew not as a single man's work, nor as a single generation's work, but as a labour of many hands bound together. The mason who cut the stone, the carpenter who raised the beams, the woman who carried the wool that bought the timber, the child who hauled water to the men on the scaffold. It was not one life that built it, but a multitude. And yet, though hunger was gone, sorrow remained, for Jack and Aliena, though drawn together, were torn apart by the law and by Alfred, who bound Aliena to himself through a cold and loveless marriage. Jack wandered again, restless, seeking not only escape but knowledge. He walked roads that led to France, and there he saw wonders that few in England had ever imagined. He saw cathedrals rising with arches sharp as spears, with windows wide as fields, with towers light as air. He learned from the masters of Chartres and Paris, watching how they bent stone to new forms, how they filled walls with glass, how they built not fortresses of God, but palaces of light. And in his heart he vowed to bring that vision back to Kingsbridge. He returned at last, a man transformed, carrying knowledge like treasure, carrying hope like fire. He looked upon the clumsy walls Alfred had built, heavy and dark, and he saw their weakness. He saw where they would fall, and fall they did, for Alfred had no vision, only pride. His vaults cracked, his walls trembled, and when they fell, they buried his name in shame. Jack rose in his place, and the cathedral rose with him. And so slowly, through famine and fire, through cruelty and loss, the great work continued. The people of Kingsbridge, who had known hunger and war, who had seen lords rise and fall, who had suffered under William's hand, found in the cathedral a hope that endured. For each stone they laid was not only for God, but for themselves, for their children, for the memory that they too had lived and laboured and endured. Jack returned not as the boy who had once wandered the woods with pockets full of pebbles, but as a man who carried in his mind the shapes of great cathedrals, rising like frozen music against the sky. He had walked the streets of Paris, narrow and crowded, filled with cries of vendors and the stench of smoke, and above those streets he had seen spires like lances and arches that lifted not with weight, but with grace. He had stood beneath windows that glowed like fire, each pane a jewel set in stone, and when the sun poured through them, the walls themselves seemed to vanish, leaving only light and colour, as if heaven itself had bent low to touch the earth. These things he brought back to Kingsbridge, though he had no parchment, no scrolls, no sketches, but those drawn in memory. He came with eyes that remembered curves and lines, with hands that knew how to turn stone into wings. He came to a town weary of struggle, to walls cracked and fallen, to a church that had become a ruin. Alfred's pride had built heavy where it should have been light, had forced stone to obey instead of letting it soar, and so the vaults had split, the towers had trembled, and in their fall they had left only rubble. The people were dismayed, for their labour had been lost, their coin wasted, their hopes cast down again. Yet when Jack returned, they saw in him not only a mason, not only a builder, but a bearer of vision. His words were few, but his drawings, scratched in dust, spoke of a new kind of building, one that would not crush the earth but rise from it, one that would not trap shadows but invite the light. Slowly, cautiously they listened. Slowly, cautiously they believed. Aliena, who had suffered much, who had endured hunger and shame and loveless marriage, saw him and felt the weight fall from her heart. She had once thought her vow to Richard would bind her forever to duty, to the hard trade of wool, to a life without joy. But in Jack's eyes she saw again the boy who had sheltered her in ruins, the boy who had made her laugh when laughter seemed impossible. Though years and grief had changed them, though the world had tried to keep them apart, the bond between them remained, like a thread never broken. Alfred, her husband in name, felt the thread too, but for him it burned with rage. He had never won Aliena's heart, had never earned her respect. And when Jack stood taller than him, in craft and in love, Alfred's bitterness grew. He had failed as a builder. He had failed as a husband. He had failed as a man. His anger turned inward, souring him until all that remained was resentment. Philip, the prior, watched all these things with the eyes of one who had prayed for many years and seen prayers answered slowly, painfully, sometimes not at all. He saw the ruin of Alfred's work as a trial sent by God, a lesson in patience, a test of faith. And when Jack stepped forward, when the people looked to him, Philip felt a quiet certainty. This, he thought, was the builder God had meant for them all along. And so the work began again. Stones were raised once more, but this time they did not crush the earth with their heaviness. They leaned upon one another in balance, in harmony, their weight carried not down but out, into graceful arches that spread like branches. The walls rose, but they were thinner, lighter, open to windows that would one day be filled with glass. It was not the old way of building, but a new way, born of vision and of trust. The people marveled as they watched the shape emerge. Where once they had known only thick walls and dim interiors, now they saw a space that promised light, air, and beauty. It was as though the very spirit of the town was being lifted, inch by inch, with every stone Jack laid. But though the cathedral rose, danger still lurked beyond its walls. William Hamley had not forgotten Kingsbridge. He saw their work and hated it. For each stone that rose was a wound to his pride, each arch an insult to his power. He swore he would see it fall again, swore he would trample the people beneath his horse's hooves. and Valoran, the bishop, whose ambition was cloaked in holy robes, still plotted in the shadows, seeking to bend the cathedral to his will. The struggle was not ended. The stones rose higher, but with them rose the dangers, the conflicts, the jealousies. Each step upward was fragile, for at any moment the weight of greed and hatred might pull it all down. And yet, even with shadows gathering, the work went on, day by day, season by season, as it always had, for such was the nature of great works. They were not built in triumph, but in endurance. Aliena carried her burdens as she had carried wool, bundle by bundle, across the cold roads of England. The wind bit her cheeks, the mud clung to her skirts, the sun blistered her hands, yet she did not falter. Every merchant she bargained with, every traveller she persuaded to buy her wool, every coin she earned was a thread in the great tapestry of her vow. She thought of her brother Richard, wandering lands stripped of title, of their father, whose memory was a shadow that would not leave her, and of the cathedral, rising slowly in Kingsbridge, stone by patient stone. The work of trade was no less perilous than the work of stone. Rival merchants sought to cheat her. Townsfolk whispered that a woman could not command respect in the market, that she could not weigh fleece fairly, could not carry coin without faltering. Yet Aliena endured, for she had learned the rhythm of patience, the rhythm of survival. She walked the same roads countless times, memorized every village and inn, every gate and bridge, until she could travel blindfolded, counting only the number of steps to reach the next town. Each journey was a small conquest, each coin she brought home a triumph, each delivery of wool a seed planted in the soil of hope. Even in her labor, she found moments to dream. She imagined the cathedral's walls tall and luminous, glass filling the arches, stone rising toward heaven, the bells sounding over Kingsbridge to summon pilgrims and townsfolk alike. In those moments, she saw her brother Richard restored, though in truth she knew she could not control the world. She could only shape it by the work of her hands, the steadfastness of her will. And so she carried on, season after season, bundle after bundle, never resting, never yielding. The wool and the cathedral intertwined in her thoughts as the labor of survival became the labor of faith. Jack watched her from afar when his travels allowed him brief visits, and he marveled at her endurance. He saw how she moved among merchants, how she spoke with firmness, yet with courtesy, how she bent not to threat or insult, and he knew that her will was as much a pillar of Kingsbridge as any stone he might lay. Her labor fed the cathedral as surely as his own, for every coin she sent to the priory bought timber, bought tools, bought bread for the masons who rose before dawn to carve the walls. And Jack, with his vision of arches and vaults, knew that it was not only stone, but the patient work of women like Aliena that lifted the building toward the sky. Richard, for his part, remained a shadowed figure, brave yet impatient, ambitious yet inexperienced. He tried to help, tried to wield influence where he could, but he was always dependent on Aliena, whose foresight and courage were far greater than his. Still, he learned from her, slowly, though the lessons of patience were bitter. He saw the townspeople rally to her cause, saw the cathedral rise despite the threats of William Hamley, and in silence he came to understand that strength was not measured only in sword or title, but in endurance and resolve. And through all these years, William Hamley fumed. He rode the roads of the countryside, meting out cruelty to those who dared support Kingsbridge. He blocked trade routes, sent men to threaten merchants, and watched Aliena's caravans with growing hatred, wishing to see them burn. Yet she moved too cleverly, avoided the worst of his plots, and each thwarted attempt only made her more determined, her eyes sharper, her resolve like iron. She had learned patience from famine, endurance from loss, cunning from necessity, and she wielded them quietly, but with lethal precision. Meanwhile, the cathedral itself grew with the passing of seasons. Jack implemented the knowledge he had brought from France. He raised pointed arches, carefully distributing the weight so that the walls could soar higher without crushing the foundations. He laid ribbed vaults, each one calculated and precise, each one lifting the nave toward the heavens. He introduced larger windows, for light, for beauty, for the promise of a space alive rather than imprisoned. The masons worked under his watchful eye, copying each motion, each angle, each cut. And Philip, observing from below, whispered prayers as the stones rose, touching each piece as if his hand could bless it, his faith binding the work together. Even as the cathedral grew, the threats did not cease. William Hamley's men burned a warehouse of timber, overturned carts of stone, harried workers returning from quarries. Valoran the bishop continued his plots in secret, trying to persuade lords to intervene, trying to force the priory under his control. And still, Jack, Aliena, Philip, and the people of Kingsbridge endured. Every disaster was met with renewed effort, every setback with patient repair, and slowly, with every year, every season, every day of patient labor, the cathedral became more than a building. It became a testament to the persistence of human will, to the power of shared vision, to the enduring faith of those who worked and suffered and hoped. Each stone, each window, each carved figure told of the hands that had lifted it, the minds that had designed it, the hearts that had endured to see it completed. Alfred's pride had long burdened him. He had once sought to claim the cathedral as his own, to raise walls that he might boast of skill and strength, yet his hands were heavy, his mind impatient, his heart blind. The vaults he had begun split beneath their own weight. The arches sagged, the stones fell, and the work crumbled before it could rise. Each failure etched deeper lines upon his face, etched deeper bitterness into his spirit. He blamed others, he blamed fate, he blamed the stones themselves, yet nothing could mend the flaws born of his own haste. Jack, who had returned from distant lands, saw the ruin and sighed silently. He did not rejoice in Alfred's failure, though the ruin cleared the path for his own vision. He took up the fallen stones, examined each one, traced the cracks, measured every fall, and slowly, methodically, he began again. His hands were steady, his mind precise, his heart full of patience. Every arch he carved, every vault he raised, every window he measured and positioned was guided not by pride, not by haste, but by knowledge and by care. He had seen how stone could soar, how light could flow, how a building could breathe. And he built not for himself, not for fame, not for wealth, but for the hope that the work would outlast all who labored upon it. Aliena watched him, her eyes filled with both awe and relief. She had endured much, years of travel, hardship, loss, and the bitter marriage to Alfred. She had carried wool across frozen roads, bargained with merchants, raised coin and timber, fed the masons, and supported her brother. And now, finally, she saw the fruits of her labor join with Jack's skill. The cathedral grew taller, lighter, more beautiful than any she had imagined. She walked its rising walls in thought, imagining the light pouring through the tall windows, imagining pilgrims bowing before the altar, imagining the bells ringing above Kingsbridge to summon all to prayer and wonder. Yet the enemies of Kingsbridge did not relent. William Hamley, fat and cruel, still sought ruin. He sent men to harry the quarries, to attack the caravans of timber, to threaten Aliena herself. But she moved with cunning, avoiding the ambushes, outsmarting the spies, making routes and deliveries where William's men could not follow. Each failed attempt only deepened his hatred. He raged in his halls, cursed the winds, cursed the earth, cursed the stones themselves for rising despite him. Bishop Valoran, in his quiet cloisters, continued his subtle schemes. He sought to bend the cathedral under his control, to claim credit for what was not his, to command the priory through fear and authority. He whispered to lords, he pressed the law, he manipulated men with threats of excommunication and penance. Yet Philip, aged now but resolute, did not yield. He stood as prior, unwavering, his prayers steady, his counsel firm, his faith the unseen mortar holding the cathedral and the people together. The building rose inch by inch, decade by decade. Every stone placed carried the weight not only of itself, but of the years of toil and loss that preceded it. The scaffolds creaked beneath the laborers' feet, the ropes groaned under the pulleys, the chisels bit the stone with sharp, repetitive rhythm. And through it all, Jack and Aliena persevered. Jack carved and measured, adjusted and guided, his eyes tracing every line, his hands shaping every curve. Aliena counted the coin, ordered the timber, ensured the workers were fed, ensured that the project could continue despite fire, famine, greed, and war. And gradually, slowly, the cathedral began to take its final form. The arches reached higher, the windows opened wider, the vaults stretched across the nave with grace. Light began to pour through the tall, coloured panes, spilling into the space like liquid, casting rainbow patterns on stone and floor. The bells were hung, though their first ringing would not come until the last stone was in place. Every detail, carved figure, and carefully measured angle spoke of decades of patience, endurance, and faith. William Hamley's power waned. His cruelty no longer inspired fear, for the people had endured. His plots failed, his men were scattered, his wealth diminished, and at last he faded into obscurity, a shadow among the living. Valoran, too, was checked, restrained by the unity of those who had laboured for the cathedral, by Philip's wisdom, by Jack's knowledge, and by Aliena's perseverance. The enemies of Kingsbridge had not vanquished the dream, and the city's heart rose higher with each passing year. And then, at last, the final stones were set. The scaffolds were lowered, the masons stepped back, their hands raw, their backs bent, their spirits tired but unbroken. Jack stood in the nave, tracing the lines of arches with his eyes. Aliena, beside him, felt the weight of the years fall from her shoulders. Philip, aged and grey, whispered a prayer of thanks, bowing his head to the stones that had become a monument to God, to hope, and to endurance. The Cathedral of Kingsbridge was complete. It stood not only as a building, not only as a church, but as a testament to all who had laboured, all who had suffered, all who had hoped. Every stone told a story of hands worn and scarred. Every window carried the light of vision long deferred. Every arch, every vault, every tower echoed with decades of struggle, endurance, and faith. And when the bells rang for the first time, they did not merely call the faithful, they rang for all who had dreamed, all who had laboured, all who had survived to see their vision realised. The city of Kingsbridge thrived around it, but the cathedral remained timeless. Jack and Aliena walked its aisles together, their hands clasped, their eyes lifted toward the light. Richard found his place quietly, humbled but content. Alfred faded into obscurity, his pride buried with the mistakes of his hands. William Hamley was forgotten. Philip's prayers lingered in every corner, silent and enduring. And the cathedral, majestic, luminous, unyielding, stood as it had been meant to stand, a house of stone and light, built by many, blessed by faith, and destined to endure far beyond the lives of those who had made it real. And so the Cathedral of Kingsbridge stood, its towers reaching into the sky, its windows glowing with the colours of the sun, its stones settled in patient silence. And the people of Kingsbridge went about their lives beneath it, carrying on the rhythms of daily work, of bread and cloth, of trade and toil. Children ran through the streets, their laughter echoing faintly against the walls of the cathedral. Merchants called to one another across the market, weighing wool and grain, counting coins, bargaining endlessly. The bells rang at dawn and at dusk, marking the hours, marking the seasons, marking the passage of time itself. Decades passed, and the years softened the edges of memory. Jack grew older, his hair greying, his hands scarred, but his eyes still bright with the knowledge of what he had built. Aliena moved with a steadier step, her hands still busy with trade, her mind still calculating the movements of wool and coin. Yet her heart lighter now, for the cathedral was no longer only a dream. It was real, and it bore the marks of all their labours. Philip's body grew frail, his hair white, his voice soft, yet the strength of his faith lingered in the walls, in the stones, in the echo of prayers that would never end. Richard found peace in quiet work, in tending lands, in observing the town he had once sought to rule with ambition and fire. He walked the streets under the shadow of the towers, remembered the suffering of his youth, and learned humility in the long, slow passing of time. Alfred, long gone from influence, was remembered only as a caution, a shadow of pride and failure that faded from memory as the cathedral endured. And the people came and went, as people always do. Pilgrims arrived, tired and hungry, seeking solace beneath the towering arches, and they left with hearts lifted by the beauty, by the quiet majesty of the stone and glass. Townsfolk carried on their trades, building new houses, repairing old roofs, planting fields, and harvesting grain, while the cathedral remained silent and patient, a witness to all their comings and goings, a monument to labor and endurance. Even the smallest details mattered in time: the moss that grew on the north wall in the damp winter, the birds that nested in the highest arches, the sunlight that moved across the nave at dawn, painting colors on stone and floor. Each day was repeated, each day slightly different, yet the cathedral remained unchanged, a slow heartbeat against the rushing life of men. Generations were born beneath its towers. Children who had never known famine or fire learned the story of those who had labored long before them. The names of Jack, Aliena, Philip, and even Tom, whose vision had begun it all, were whispered in reverence, taught in schools, remembered in quiet prayers. The cathedral did not need these names to endure, yet the memory of the builders clung to it, invisible but present, like the very air that moved through its arches. And so the centuries passed. Kings rose and fell. Wars came and went. The land changed hands. Yet the Cathedral of Kingsbridge stood. Its walls, its windows, its towers, all endured. The labor of many hands, the patience of many hearts, the faith of those who had never wavered, these remained, etched into stone and glass, carried by the wind, by the echo of footsteps in the aisles, by the quiet hum of a town living beneath its shadow. And even when the builders were dust, even when the dreams of the living became memories of the past, the cathedral whispered its story. It told of toil and suffering, of hope and perseverance, of hands that cut and lifted stone, of hearts that endured beyond the measure of years. It spoke in silence, in light, in shadow, and it would continue to speak long after all men had gone, long after the voices that had begun it were forgotten. And so it remained, through all time, a witness, a monument, a dream turned to stone, a story of patience and endurance, carried forever in the stillness of walls and the flow of light through colored glass.